so happy to see all of you here. And so today we are here to hear a discussion and also to engage in the discussion about Singumbe's new book called The Homeowner Ideology, Economic Utility or Utility of Real Property Rights in 4 African Cities. Where do you buy this book? I want to start off by that. In case you forget, on your tables, there's a QR code. You can scan the QR code to take you to the website where the book, or you can purchase the book. And if you want an extra 50% off, there's a special code on the post as well. It says extra code is spring25 for 50% off, right? And we're so grateful to Stefan today, who is going to join us to discuss the book with Singumbe. And I just want to introduce them briefly to the gentlemen. You want to sit down so I can see who is here. Thank you. Yeah, I was saying we're so grateful for Stefan for agreeing to be sort of a discussant and facilitator in terms of unpacking what Singumbe's book is all about for all of us. Of course, we're going to give you an opportunity to ask questions, but in a little bit, let me just introduce our esteemed colleagues and distinguished scholars here at the Joseph Korbel. So Dr. Singumbe Muyeba is an assistant professor of African Studies. He is a co-faculty member of the Institute of Comparative and Regional Studies, focusing on African programming. He is an award-winning teacher, having had the honor to be voted the Korbel School's Distinguished Teaching Award in 2023. His book, The Homeowner Ideology, Economic Utility or Utility, depending on how you read the book, she writes, in 4 African Cities, was published by the University of Michigan in March of 2024. His previous book, Globalization in Africa in the 21st Century, A Zambian Perspective, was published by Author House in 2008. He has published numerous articles in top-tier journals on formalization of property rights among low-income households in informal settlement, inequality, and poverty in Africa. His current research focuses on measuring and modeling global populations living in slum conditions using innovative, novel methods. Dr. Muyeba holds a PhD in sociology and an MPhil in development studies from the University of Cape Town in South Africa and a BA from the University of Zambia. In the United States, he has attended Yale University as a Fox International Fellow and attended summer school on development and equality in the Global South at Brown University. He has also attended summer school at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands, and previously has worked for the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, and the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, UNHCR, and the Massachusetts Housing and Shelter Alliance. Dr. Singumbe Muyeba. Dr. Stefan Chavez-Norgaard is a teaching assistant professor of public policy at the Korbel School's Douglas and Mary Scribner Institutes of Public Policy. He teaches courses related to urban planning, public policy analysis, ethics, and policy writing, as well as applied lab-based course on housing policy. Dr. Chavez-Norgaard's research lies at the intersection of procedural justice and urban development with an eye toward equity. Specific areas of focus include urban planning, history and theory, local government and planning law, mixed methods research focused on planning practice and urban governance in the related but distinct late liberal context of South Africa and the United States. So some intersection there with Singumbe from South Africa. Stefan is passionate about participatory democracy and how cities, private and public arrangements affect equitable urban development. His dissertation examined areas of apartheid-era forced relocation in South Africa and how master plans have been implemented and repurposed in these geographies by residents and planners. His forthcoming research will explore possibilities for equitable, democratic urban development in Denver. Dr. Chavez-Norgaard received his PhD in urban planning from the University of Columbia's Graduate School of Architecture Planning and Preservation in 2024. He also holds a master's degree in public policy degree from Harvard Kennedy School and a Bachelor of Arts in Public Policy and Urban Studies from Stanford University with the interdisciplinary honors in democracy, development, and the rule of law. He is an active member of several professional associations, including American Association of Geographers, American Collegiate Schools of Planning, Urban Affairs Association, and Society for American City and Regional Planning History. This is just a brief biography of Stefan. Welcome, Dr. Right, I'll pass over to Stefan, who is going to lead us into the discussion, and thereafter he will open it up for you to be able to ask the question.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Abby, for that fantastic, very generous introduction. It's great for all of you to be here. Thank you. It's week 9. I know it's a busy time of the quarter, so all of you being here really means a lot to both myself and I'm sure to Singumbe as well, to Dr. Muyeba. I'm going to just start by saying that I had a chance to read this book in considerable depth over the past 3 weeks or so, and was really, really taken by it, and would highly recommend that each of you consider reading it as well. The topic of concern, landed property regimes and different alternatives to how landed property arrangements might exist across the African continent, really echoes globally. And there are a lot of questions about how to do things like reduce poverty or increase development outcomes that this book really gestures towards. And I don't want to give too much away of the argument, but Dr. Muyeba finds that, contextually and culturally grounded solutions might look different in different places. And that there might not necessarily be one surefire solution toward landed property regimes that must be applied, from the global north to the global south, as it were, and in a monolithic way. But I'm going to start by sort of just talking about my overall experience reading the book with a question for Dr. Muyeba. And throughout, there are going to be a couple terms of art that I hope Dr. Muyeba can sort of define as we go. Right. So as we talk about in this world of land tenure and landed property regimes, terms like freehold tenure, terms like leasehold or usufruct rights, right? These are sort of a bit of jargon to the field. And so Dr. Muyeba will define some of these as we go. But one great thing that one must know about the book, and you kind of find out as soon as you read it, is that it's got this 4 case study research site design. And so the reader is taken from Nairobi, Kenya, to a township outside of Cape Town, South Africa, site Sikalicha, to Lusaka, Zambia, to Luanda, Angola. And that's a really, really prolific sweep across very different African countries and experiences, right, with the unique example of apartheid animating South African history, with issues of decolonization movements in Zambia, for example, and with the Civil War in Angola, right? So these are very different contexts. And my first question to Dr. Muyeba is sort of how you selected these 4 tremendously diverse case study sites for the book.
Thank you, Stefan. And good afternoon, everyone. It's always weird hearing, people talk about what you've written about. This sounds very important. When I was writing it, it was really something that I just enjoyed. I want to start off by saying thank you. There's a long list of people in the acknowledgements pages where I just, say thanks, but there are a lot of colleagues here and some of them are present. Professor Epstein, thank you so much. She made sure that I had, a workshop where I could have some experts discuss my book manuscript, and, I was able to do a lot in terms of making the manuscript better because of that, and just all the support. The dean, Naz, is here, as well as Rebecca, who I traveled every single day when I was in the office. And she gave advice. And like I said, the last time we had a meeting discussing, the books, if you want to find out whether you are among people who are in the acknowledgement section, please buy it. So how did I select the cases? So it was a combination of convenience as well as purposive. So convenience, I was at the time, 2011, I was studying at the University of Cape Town. I was trying to understand all these issues around housing in South Africa. And it just happened that 15 miles away was Khayelitsha, which is one of the biggest informal settlements in Africa with over 450,000 people. And so I was trying to understand, how there was all this push for home ownership as a way to, solve all these issues around people living in informal settlements. And at the time, Fernando de Soto's work on, the mystery of capital, where he suggested that across the developing world, there were trillions of dollars in assets, right, among people living in informal settlements, and including the land that they lived on and the shacks that they owned. And so in trying to understand the relationship between these interventions that were being suggested in terms of home ownership, I saw that there was an opportunity. I was studying at the University of Cape Town and I could go to Khayelitsha. So that's where it starts off. And so that's the case of freehold home ownership. And freehold here means people owning land, having land and housing, owning it in perpetuity, right? With no constraints on passing it down to, succeeding generations. So it's really freehold ownership. That was the case for South Africa. For Zambia, there's one reason, first important reason. Some of you know it. Right? It's the best country in the world. I joke. But it turned out, right? So I'm from Zambia, and I was aware of these cases that were happening where there was privatization of public assets. And this is during the time when there was structural adjustment program. And for low-income households that were living in these dilapidated houses that had been made during colonialism, the government had decided to sell those houses to the people that were living in there. And there was this idea that they were going to sell them at 100% discount. So basically free. And so for me, I thought that looking at that case contrasted with Cape Town. Why? In Cape Town, there was freehold transfer, right? And people were buying houses, subsidized houses. So there were housing subsidies provided by the government. In the case of Zambia, those houses were being transferred through a process of privatization. So for me, it was two different cases of looking at interventions for addressing people living in informal settlements. Then I learned about the case of the Kenya Slum Upgrading Program. And in the Kenya Slum Upgrading Program, they were providing mortgages. They were providing mortgage opportunities for people living in informal settlements, and particularly in Kibera, which is, the second largest slum or the second largest informal settlement in Africa with over 800,000 people. And so the idea of using mortgages, right, was quite different. It was a new thing across Africa. Typically, debt is not something that a lot of societies or economies want to use, particularly for all manner of reasons. So Kenya represented a very interesting case because it was the delivery of home ownership through mortgages. So I had these three different cases, different interventions, all aimed at the same thing, home ownership. And so I wanted to also have a case where I could, compare, right? Where there was no home ownership, but there was transfer of housing. And in Luanda, in Angola, there was a case of transfer of housing through and basically building of social housing. There were these societies, these communities that had experienced landslides. These communities living in areas that were, in hazardous areas. And so the government decided to move those people. And doing so, they built houses for them and then delivered those houses. They could not sell, they could not do anything. The only thing they could do is live there. So they provided usufruct rights, which means, you can basically just use them for the purpose of living there as a dwelling. So that for me represented a good comparison. And so that's how I ended up selecting those cases.
Fantastic. And I think for those of us who have been in the sort of more formal training around land regimes and land tenure policies, Dr. Muyeba's book is so powerful in part because it's questioning long-held conventional wisdom. So Hernando de Soto's Mystery of Capital, for example, is really treated as sacrosanct in a lot of circles. And this idea that titling in particular, that making sure that high poverty individuals in informal settlements or slums would have access to a title deed through then freehold market arrangements, right? This is something that's been promoted by the World Bank, by various development agencies over decades, and indeed by philanthropy and civil society as well. So the Ford Foundation's programs have long promoted titling as a surefire path to poverty reduction and development, and even to this day, the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy continues to have its titling program as one of its largest kind of international policy arrangements. And Dr. Muyeba is not saying that there's no role for titling ever, right? It's a more nuanced and contextually grounded take. But with that in mind, I also want to quickly interject that the term informal settlement or slum, that can be used interchangeably. Joel Botnick, a former head of Slum Shack Dwellers International, has done a lot of work talking about slums as a term of possible empowerment in some of these very low-income communities demanding recognition and rights. So something certainly to think about in various contexts. Another aspect of Dr. Muyeba's book concerns this question of ideology. And Dr. Muyeba makes use of Gramsci's theory on Gramscian hegemony to understand that, a lot of the residents of these very low-income informal settlements in the 4 case studies, right, they may have a disconnect between what they perceive to be in their interests for wealth building and economic utility and what the actual data show, right? And this ideological or hegemonic role that homeownership plays, according to Dr. Muyeba and according to the book, right, is really where this homeowner ideology comes into play. And it's where this sacrosanct treatment of titling and freehold tenure come in as well. And so one thing Dr. Muyeba does is ties this historically to structural adjustment and structural adjustment programs throughout the late 20th century, even into the 1990s, in places like and not including just Zambia, right? And so I'd love for you to speak on that for a second. First, maybe you can sort of talk about this question of Gramscian hegemony and what the homeowner ideology means in that frame, and then tying it to structural adjustment. And the final thing I'll note is that one of the big analytic moves that this book makes is it uses this term structured idle capital. I'm going to let Dr. Muyeba tell us what that means, because it's pretty important to understanding the argument of the book. But structured idle capital, according to Dr. Muyeba, is sort of where this structural adjustment and privatization inflected regime leaves many low-income residents as they try to buy homes. Oh, you've got one.
I think Stefan will be great marketing, Michael. Great decision. So I'll start with the idea of structured idle capital. So within economics, there's this idea of idle capital, which is capital that firms or individuals will leave without investing, right, for a time, until a time when they see that it is profitable to do so. So, and they have the leverage. They can do that at whatever time. When it comes to people who are living in low-income communities, people living in informal settlements, even if you provide them with houses, right, and you provide them with property rights to that land, they become homeowners, it is very difficult for them to actually take that next step of using that capital for profit. It is very difficult for them to get loans, right? The banks, typically the idea is that that house should be used as collateral, or that land should be used as collateral. But the banks do not accept it. Why? Because of lower value. At the same time, even if they accepted those houses, the banks also want that the individuals are working. And so there are no jobs, particularly for people living in informal settlements. The other idea is that informal settlements, even if you upgrade them, the value of the entire settlement, right, even if it now has, all these services, et cetera, the value still remains lower than the general value of houses. And so there are all these constraints, right? There are all these constraints, and those are the things that structure, right, these individuals. So they're not able to use their idle capital. That idle capital is actually structured. And this contrasts with what was the dominant idea within the field, right, of property rights and development, that when those trillions in assets that are dead capital, right, that Fernando de Soto was referring to, and when those are formalized, they become a formal part of the economy and now can be used. The idea that Fernando de Soto suggested that they become really alive, right, and people can now utilize those resources. They can invest in those resources, can get utility out of them. But actually what happens is they become structured idle capital. And so people cannot utilize. On the idea of structure adjustment programs and the idea of Gramsci. So, structure adjustment programs, the way I read structure adjustment programs was that they were a way to transform societies, right? From primarily, an ideology that, the socialist ideology mostly, to neoliberal ideologies. And the whole idea of neoliberal ideology has got this section of scholars, right, that are market fundamentalists. And they're the ones that advance this idea, making all these claims that, when there's formalization of property rights, then there will be all these impacts that will reduce poverty. But it is really just claims. So particularly when you apply them to low-income housing, particularly when it is formalized, right, among people who are low-income, this idea that It will drive them out of poverty through access to loans. They will have jobs. They will have all of these opportunities. Those are all claims that we do not observe on the ground. So that's where the structure adjustment program aspects come in. And if you remember, scholars like Milton Friedman, right? These are ideas that Friedman advanced along with Bella Balassa and a lot of other scholars, and etc. And in fact, if you remember, Milton Friedman particularly had been, advisor to Margaret Thatcher during Thatcherism, as well as Reagan during Reaganomics, and all those ideas were about, liberalizing and privatizing and ensuring that the market was, the primary means through which everything was done, and so just advancing neoliberalism. With Gramsci, within the study of home ownership, there are some scholars that advance the idea that in any given society, the dominant mode through which people access housing depends on what the elites value. So, for societies where you have, primarily homeowner societies, right? There's a dominant ideology that has taken over, and that is the homeownership ideology, and particularly cases of the United States and the United Kingdom after a certain point. Those are considered, and Australia, right? These are considered societies where this home ownership, and it's called home ownership ideology, comes through. But for me, I step a little bit away from Gramsci, and I do not see neoliberalism in particularly these African contexts as a dominant ideology. It is more of a pervasive ideology. It's a pervasive idea. And that is why we can, see that when other ideas come in that are not aligned with neoliberalism, we still identify some of this. And particularly for the case of Angola, right? That is not the dominant ideology.
Yeah, and I think, going back to Thatcher, I think it was a Margaret Thatcher quote, "There is no alternative," or Tina, right? And so what I think Dr. Muyeba is saying is actually in many of these contexts, there are alternatives, and these alternatives are under contestation. I think it's also worth, many of you may know some of the Cold War era context for these places, but we don't always think about, or I don't always think about Southern Africa as a front line in the Cold War battles, but it very much was, right? And what apartheid South Africa called the, quote, border wars in Angola, for example, right, was this place where the USSR and the US were heavily involved in different investments. And indeed, the US at that time was an ally to apartheid South Africa, as some of you might recall. It was Chester Crocker in African Affairs at the State Department who had this policy of constructive engagement with the apartheid regime. And in an Angola context, right, this civil war that the country was experiencing was a real question over, a Cold War proxy of joining on the sides of the US or the USSR. And you can perhaps see some of these resultant institutional arrangements today in 2025 and the contestations as sort of a legacy of some of these Cold War era, battles, and land and property are just one place where that happens. So maybe for this third question, we can turn in greater depth to this case of Angola, where usufruct or use rights and leasehold tenure are sort of introduced as legitimate alternatives to home ownership, freehold market tenure, mortgages, right, and to fairly great success. As Dr. Muyeba finds, a lot of the residents have positive experiences with feelings of security and stability in place, meaning not fearing evictions frequently, which is one of the purported major benefits of homeownership, right, is security and stability in place. Dr. Muyeba finds that actually usufruct rights can perhaps do the same thing in certain moments. And similarly, that residents have a lot of purported satisfaction and dignity and respectability alongside their living situations. Another major purported benefit of homeownership. You know, one question I wanted to ask was about this issue of customary communal tenure in different African countries. Some of you may know that customary communal tenure, where land is allocated by a traditional leader, a chief, a headman. Sometimes residents might pay a nominal fee, but they're able to have these land rights often for free or for very low cost. Is a widespread alternative, but there have been a lot of critics of traditional land ownership, including some gender inequalities and ethnic inequalities, right? There might be in-group and out-groups in terms of who has access to traditional landowning, customary communal tenure. But what about that landed property arrangement? Is that something that ought to also be given that kind of consideration with the Angola case?
That's a great question. So one of the main things, I'll do one of those things like, oh, that's really for other experts. It's kind of a delimitation of the book, right? That the main focus is on urban land tenure, right? And really cities. But that's not to say that, I have not looked at some of the literature in that area. And particularly for Angola, I'll start off with Angola, that during the war, right, Angola went through this war that started early in the 1960s, first of all, trying to get independence. And then once it got independence, suddenly in 1975, then it went into the civil war. And that civil war went all the way until 2002. But what was happening for Angola really is about 65% of the population moved to urban areas, right? So you have a smaller population in rural areas, most of the population moving to urban areas because the fighting was located in the rural areas. But when it comes to land tenure and the productivity of land tenure, right? When it's under traditional authorities, what has been observed, there are some studies, Tim Beasley has done a study in Ghana, Hailu and Brooks, as well as Klaus Denninger. They have looked at cases in Ethiopia and across the developing countries. Alan Kane has done some work in Angola as well. What they show is when there is that transfer of property rights, there are economic benefits, right? There are economic benefits, and this is because when you don't have those rights to land, you do not have a title deed, you do not have protection from the state. It means that whatever you produce can easily be taken away and you don't have any recourse to justice. And so in some of these cases, what has been advanced is that there are a lot of benefits for agricultural productivity, because in rural areas, it's mainly agricultural productivity. However, what has also been shown by scholars like Ruth Mainzendick and Esther Mwangi in Kenya is that when there are individual rights that are introduced within these contexts that are usually so collective, what ends up happening is that there's a breakdown in social capital. So whereas people were using common grounds for water sources, for grazing, et cetera, et cetera. When somebody comes in and has those land rights, they fence off that area. And so what happens that people then do not meet the way that they used to meet, or there are all these conflicts that arise as a result. So, there is a win in that there is some economic benefits, but on the downside, there is a social capital that breaks down. And even in urban areas, actually, the breakdown of social capital has been identified, has been observed for those that, for the areas that have experienced formalization. But it builds up over time. So you find that after 30 years, during the first generation of those that have gotten new housing, right, it takes about 30 years for them to now start building that social capital.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think we might want to pause for a second to see if anybody has any questions from the audience so far. Otherwise, I have plenty more. But does anybody have a question for either Dr. Muyeba or myself? Okay, keep those in your heads. Get those questions formed so we can really have a discussion because there's a lot of amazing things to talk about and a variety of possible questions, including global implications of this research. But I'll start by talking about some of the methods underpinning this book. Dr. Muyeba makes use of some really fantastic natural experiments, and this is a mixed methods publication. So in each of the 4 case studies, you have a range of different methodological tools to understand this, including, as in the case of the KENSA, which is in the Kenya, the natural experiment that Dr. Muyeba looks at. We have a real live in the wild natural experiment where we have different home ownership and land tenure relations for different groups. And so we can really tease out the effect of what home ownership might do for life outcomes, across various periods of time. Similarly, in South Africa, there's the CAPS, the Cape Area Panel Study, I think. And wherever it's not possible to have a natural experiment, Dr. Muyeba uses propensity score matching. So we have matched pairs at baseline of people who did receive the treatment and those who didn't, but were of sort of equivalent baseline status. And we're able to really see the effect of these different interventions on different population groups, which is a real strength methodologically of this book. So one finding from these more quantitative parts of the methods is this disjuncture between the real economic outcomes, right? That the data that ask everything from, do you own a car or refrigerator, or all the way to what is your household income, right? There are these real economic questions, and then there are these questions that have to do with perceptions, attitudes, values, and beliefs. And this disjuncture is that home ownership seems to have some statistically significant results for people's self-perception of dignity and worth. So we see some self-perception statistics and findings, but the actual real economic data around, for example, assets and savings, we don't see any real differences in these contexts. So that's my question to you, Dr. Muyeba. Is that the homeowner ideology at work right there? That difference between perception and economic outcomes?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I want to see if I can read one of the stories to kind of highlight that before I answer the question. So this is the story of Paul. So Paul is a South African in Khayelitsha. She lives in a township in Cape Town's Cape Flats at the southern tip of Africa, Khayelitsha. The post-apartheid government in Cape Town built new houses for disenfranchised Black Africans. It is 2011, and Paul is a housing subsidy beneficiary. With an air of confidence, she tells us that owning her house allowed her to become a madam, suggesting a social status that commands respect. Black women housekeepers used madam to refer to white South African women for whom they worked in Cape Town's affluent southern suburbs. Paul lived in a shack inside sea after moving to Cape Town from Eastern Cape Province in 1983. She labored as a domestic worker for the same madam for many years. I used to look at my madam and never knew I could be like her, she recounts. I used to watch her eating her breakfast, wearing her gown. I didn't know that I can be a madam, but today I do everything. I am happy. So with Mpo's experience, this really emanates from the fact that she now owns the house and that she can enjoy this self-esteem. She has, higher self-esteem. She, calls herself a madam, which in the US context means something different. So I would not necessarily strongly call it a disjuncture, right? So the claims that are made under the homeowner ideology, right? And just to make sure that we're on the same page, right? The homeowner ideology is really focused on these claims that market fundamentalists make and libertarian philosophers make around property ownership, right? That they have all these things. It's like, you reach a certain you talk about, right? And so the claims tend to focus on economic benefits, but there are those that also make the other claims, those that are more measured by perceptive indices and measures. So there are claims that homeowners are better citizens, right? That homeowners are able to take care of their children better, they are able to exercise social control better, that homeowners, have better political participation, that they have better social capital really. But then the idea is that the focus is always on the economics. That when there is home ownership, there are economic benefits, and that this is a tool for reducing poverty. This is done right at the expense of us understanding the non-economic dimensions of the effects of property rights.
And it's worth noting that across these different contexts, Dr. Muyeba looks at these civic engagement, social participation kind of indices in the data and does not find very many statistically significant, if any. For example, homeowners being more likely to participate in civic events or local civic or residential associations. That is not borne out by the data in any way, but there is that perception in the literature, right? But some of the homeowners' self-perceptions, right, it really does seem to boost a lot of their respectability or perceptions of worth. So it's an interesting question. I'll pause for a second to see if anybody from the audience has formulated a thought or question or comment or reaction. And we'll see if so, yeah. And if you could just state your name also, and then Mandy, are you gonna run the mics or should we? Yeah.
No, my name is Zaria. So I know with Gramsci's concept of hegemony, there's the thought that in order for there to be shifts in thinking, you have to have this counterculture that challenges and eventually overtakes and becomes the new hegemonic order. So I was curious, if you feel like you're starting to see those ideas form, if you're starting to see those shifts or those those challenges to hegemony start to emerge.
So, with the way that structure adjustment programs were implemented, and this is why, I say that there's this pervasiveness of the idea of neoliberalism. Yes, there was some level of resistance to these ideas, but there is really not much that developing countries could do. They were highly indebted, right? So it's the case for Zambia, it's the case for Kenya in my case studies, right? These were highly indebted countries. They needed capital, and in order to access any resources, any drawing rights from the IMF or the World Bank, they needed to implement these structure adjustment programs. So, and the loans and the grants that were given were really tied, right? They were tied to these policies. There were conditions for getting those loans. And so, the way that the ideology just permeates through these societies happens in such a way it was very difficult for them to resist. There have been some works, Nick van der Waal, for example, has explained how, a lot of the leaders in these countries tried to delay as much as possible the implementation of some. They were pretty resistant, but they kind of had to use even deceptive ways, right? As a way to try and challenge, some of these policies, but it was incredibly difficult because they did not have the resources.
Got another question back there.
Thank you. Congratulations again for your completion of the book. And I'm glad to just listen to the conversation. I'm Nigerian, and some of the things you're saying, I can just relate to it. Sorry, my name is Peter. There's like a sense of like achievements of prestige of like just owning a home in Nigeria. It's like one of the peak of the success. But then it's like there are sometimes trade-offs. So I'm just curious in your research, if you came at how people, if that was part of your question, how do people make sense of trade-offs? For example, like I lived in Lagos for like 6 years, and there are people that have to come in 6-7 hours a day because they want to live in their own house, right? Or sometimes people have to live in a very small space because they want to own their home. So I just want to understand how that comes together.
Yeah, thank you for that, Peter. Good to see you. So I think the main and this is what we see as evidence, evident in some of the case studies. Definitely the Lusaka case study, Kenya case study too. One of the trade-offs that they had to make, right, is this idea of you own a house, right, and now you have to pay, right? Before you owned your own, shack, right, and you didn't pay anything, right? So they now had to start paying property taxes, right, and they had to start paying electricity bills, right? Instead of having that informal connection, they now have electricity bills, they have water bills, and unfortunately, for some, this meant actually losing their house because they could not pay, they could not afford. What some of them had to do, this is a case that came out very strongly in Nairobi, in Kibera. Once people got those houses, what they did is they moved to other informal settlements and then put their houses on rent. And so, you find that there's not really that reduction in the number of people living in informal settlements. And new informal settlements keep on being created, right? So there are those sort of examples. There are also those who felt that they could not afford to live in these new housing projects, particularly in the case of Angola, right? In Angola, where the houses were built very far, and also Cape Town, and actually I should use Cape Town. The settlements, the new housing projects were built about 40-minute drive, right, from the central business district. That means it was very difficult for people to actually go to those jobs. And even now, a lot of the housing projects in South Africa tend to be far away from the central business district. And so what some people do is that they will try and rent out those houses and try and move closer, to informal settlements that are closer to the CBD, or they will build a shack next to their house. They are called backyard shacks, right? They'll build a shack next to their house and then put somebody to rent in that shack, right? So there are all of these dynamics.
Congratulations for the book. My question is to just re-echo what Professor Stefan had already alluded to when he talked about traditional rulers in Africa owning lands and then selling these lands to people. We have that in Nigeria as well. And one of the downside of that is sometimes, or even most times, these traditional rulers, after selling the landed property to these people, they end up confiscating the property back. So for example, the traditional ruler can sell just the land to the individual, and then the individual gets the money to erect a building on the land. And then from nowhere, the traditional ruler comes and confiscates both the land and the building, leaving the person homeless again. So my question is this applicable to the Four Cities case study that you cited?
So in the city case studies, actually, the particularly in Lusaka, as well as in Cape Town and Angola, we do not see traditional rulers in cities. But in the case of Nairobi, there is actually a traditional ruler that is associated with where Kibera is located. And they, unfortunately, they do not have as much power, right? Because this is an urban location. Granted that the land itself has not been, there's some informal arrangement that allows people to live on that land. On government documents, Kibera does not exist, right? But it's there on the ground, right? And they have this traditional chief who does not have as much power to actually allocate the land. When the government of Nairobi, of Kenya, allocated that land, it was allocated to the Nubians. And the Nubians were people who were, they had originated from Sudan and other areas, and they were really kind of refugees in Kenya. So the government early on allocated the land to the Nubians, and the idea was that they would use that until a time when they needed to be taken back to their country. But people started, after independence, people started coming into the city and started settling near those Nubians, and then actually expanded Kibera. And so a lot of the power belongs to the central government and to the city of Nairobi.
Got a couple questions still, yeah.
Hi, I wanted to ask a little bit more about the Kenyan context as well in Nairobi. Oh, sorry, my name's Toby. So President Ruto, he's making this like giant capstone affordable housing program that's going to be a part of his administration. 103 housing units, 103,000 housing units, and he refinanced 1,005 mortgages, reflecting a 40% rise. But also, they stated that the government lacks experience and efficiency necessary for large-scale real estate development. So they're relying a lot on private sectors to sort of help finance this. So I wanted to ask how, if the private sector is increasing involvement in the creation of affordable housing projects, which is a way to give security to informal housing residents, how does this involvement from the private sector or perhaps international investors at large sort of impact that communal form of homeownership versus like propagating a neoliberal free market ideology?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks. You know, this idea of affordable housing is what the United Nations has been pushing, right? United Nations Human Settlement Program, UN Habitat has been pushing the idea of affordable housing as a way to address the housing crisis. And you know, it is a housing crisis because it is a growing problem. It's already a large problem. Just for context, you know, there are close to 1 billion people who are living in informal settlements globally. And actually that, and this is, you know, the subject of my new research, that is actually an underestimation, right? It's actually close to 2 billion people. There are different ways of measuring that have shown that it's actually more. The other idea around affordable housing is that there's a certain level of income, right, at which housing becomes affordable housing. And there are populations that we are aware of, right, that do not actually have that income in monetary terms, right? There are, you know, people living with disabilities, people who are, you know, really vulnerable that do not have that. So those are sort of an invisible population when we think of affordable housing. So in the case of Kenya, what President Ruto is doing, he's actually not focused on those low-income populations, right? For the low-income populations, that's where you find the Kenya Slum Upgrading Program. And then those that are belonging to the lower middle income groups, the middle income groups, etc., those are the ones to which affordable housing actually works as an intervention. That said, even the Kenya Slum Upgrading Program, right, as much as it is trying to, you know, address the issue of housing low-income groups in informal settlements, it has actually been found because they're using mortgages, right? There is a 10% down payment that is required. So, you know, for a studio apartment, right? A studio apartment costs 600,000 shillings. So the down payment is about 60,000, which is something like 570 US dollars, right? Even that amount is incredibly difficult for a lot of people living in informal settlements because they are living on a day-to-day basis. They are working in the informal sector. And so the Kenya Slum Upgrading Program has been found to have missed widows, people living with disabilities and orphans, missing, not able to provide housing for them. And that's something that they're now trying to address. How do they provide housing through these mortgage intervention, right? Mortgage-based intervention to provide for those that are in those vulnerable groups.
All right, thank you. Chatenda here from Zimbabwe. I want to touch base to what you sort of mentioned around this idea of having these sharks, the backyard sharks. I see the same thing happening in Zimbabwe. I'm from a high density suburb, Glenview, that was like a planned urban initiative around 1975, where you had to get married to get a house, which my parents did. But I'm also seeing the same thing now, where you have these backyard rentals and informal structures. So my question is around, what does this have to sort of say to this idea of home ownership being, like the survival of the home ownership and the flexibility on, that identity of owning homes and being able to, be more creative around, this concept that you sort of mentioned around having to invest, you own a home and you have to have this video. Yeah. Like, can you speak more to that? This hybrid, sort of like home ownership that's emerging in Africa, where you see, backyard sharks and informal structures in a planned urban property ownership.
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting. This is something that is happening because there are high levels of unemployment, right? So people are having all these backyard shacks, but also, yes, there's this growth, right, in values of home ownership. And it does bring me to the book, right, where I do argue that, if we are saying for low-income communities, right, for low-income people and informal settlements, that these economic benefits are not there. And I'm not the first person, to present evidence, right? Across Africa, there's a lot of qualitative research that has been done, right? And my research brings in the quantitative, right? But there's a lot of qualitative research that has said, actually, we do not see these economic benefits that are being advanced. And as far back as the late 1980s, there are studies that have elsewhere in other developing countries that have shown that actually, yeah, we do not see these economic benefits. So I asked the question, why is it that this narrative persists, right? And my answer is social production, right, of home ownership tenure. So home ownership tenure is not this objective reality that naturally occurring, as has been argued, right, by market fundamentalists and libertarian philosophers. They argue that it's a natural instinct, right? It's not. It is socially constructed. It is socially produced. So neoliberalism is, as an ideology, right, has produced this narrative of the importance of home ownership. And what has happened? The public sector, the state, right? The state has taken that up. And now, even in the United States, what do you see? Even though most people are not homeowners, most people are renters, right? Even though that's the case, there's so much support, so many resources are poured by the state into, promoting home ownership. So these institutions in society, ideology, as well as the state, are actually pushing this idea of home ownership. And at the same time, the family has actually, as an institution in society, has adopted this value of home ownership as the best tenure, right? And these values are passed down from generation to generation. And so you see that this persistence of this idea, even though when we look at the empirics, we're actually looking at something different.
Good afternoon, Professor. My name is John. Thank you for having us. Here in the United States, 80 years of a post-war industrial house building complex has built sprawling suburbs, massive apartment complexes, and it's inadvertently shaped the current loneliness epidemic. People move, attached to each other. Most people don't know their neighbors, have less friends on average. In your writing and research of these case studies, have you discovered any emergence in the breakdown of a shared community?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for that question. And it's good to see you. I haven't seen you in a while. So just for context, the National Institute of Health, may survive, has done these studies, right? Starting as far back as I think it was 1986, right? So every 10 years, 1986, 1996, 2006, 2016. And these studies have been tracking social cohesion and been tracking, some of the questions involve the ideas of loneliness, right? They ask questions like, if you were in a financial, in a situation where you needed, a small loan, right? How many friends do you have that you can go to, right? And et cetera, et cetera. And they come up with some of these measures of loneliness. And what has been happening is that every 10 years, the number of people that are categorized as lonely has been increasing. And now we are around 35% of the population. So if you think 35% of 350 million people, that's, about a third of the US population experiencing loneliness. Why it's so important is that loneliness actually leads to physical health problems. And that has been impacting, the medical. But that's a digression. For these studies, right? The studies do not find an impact on reduction in social capital, right? And perhaps it's in the way that I am measuring them. But qualitative studies that I did in Cape Town, and I have an article on this, is that there's been this increase in privacy in these societies that are highly collective. And that increase in privacy is kind of, my linking to that idea that there's this breakdown of social capital in these communities. So when people own their own houses, what do? The first thing they'll do is that they'll build a fence to demarcate their land. And then, particularly in South Africa, where it's a context of high crime, right? The fences are high and they make sure that, the access to their house is really, really limited. And so that is what has happened, that, where you had these communities, this sense of community, the increase in privacy is actually breaking down these social relationships.
Thanks, Singumbe, and congratulations. It's awesome to see this finally come into a physical live book, and just congratulations on the whole process. Just a question, I think you mentioned it briefly, but I just was curious to hear more. And I don't know if it depends on the type of housing or the type of arrangement, but I was also curious about, as you're describing the shacks on the land and paying, what kinds of kind of loan arrangements or debt has emerged around that. And it kind of also reminds me a lot of like the entrepreneurship discourse, which also has this loan dynamic, this debt, this using social capital for actually coercive ends. In that case, I'm often in initiatives focusing more on like the viable poor, right, versus the poorest of the poor. So I was wondering if there was any sort of similarities you saw to some of that literature, or if it's introduced new forms of kind of debt and loan cycles within some of these like areas or networks.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And thank you, Rebecca. She took a photo of me with the book.
It's required.
So there have been certain funds that have come up. So they in South Africa, there's a fund called the Kuyasa Fund. And the Kuyasa Fund provides sort of loans to not at a, sort of the formal loan. It's they say that you can use that house as collateral. That's key, right? But at the same time, you kind of obtain that loan if you don't have any kind of employment or ways in which to raise funds. Where people have actually gotten those loans, the narrative that came out of my qualitative studies were that people were defaulting and they were losing their houses. Mm-hmm. So there are also other ways. What they call the stokvel. Stokvels are these groups where homeowners come together and they all contribute a small amount, and then every month they cycle, right? They give one person, the person, after they use, they put back, and then they give the next person, just like that. And those ones are more informal. They are very difficult for members to actually police. So some people fail and they'll just say, I don't have the money. I don't have any way to get the money. I'll give it to you whenever it comes up, and then that's it. But what that has done is it has affected community initiatives. So in some of the qualitative interviews I did, anybody who comes up with a community initiative, they do not trust. And so, for example, they will say, we are having problems of garbage all over our neighborhood. Let's come together, put together some money, buy some things to use to clean up. And they say, no, we can't trust you. You will just run away with the money. So those are some of the issues, but there are some issues.
Abby, I think, has a question. Yeah, no, it's all good.
Thanks, Marty. Thank you both for this very interesting discussion. I just want to ask you, when people look at the book cover, what do you want them to go with thinking about? And every time they read the book, what should they think about when they see the cover?
That's a good question. I'm required to say that. But it is a good question. So when I was thinking about this book cover, if you can see, right, there is a bridge here, right? This is actually in Kibera. Thank you. This is a bridge. This side, and you can see some of the, black sort of dirt and all of that. This whole area is kind of representing life in the informal settlement, in the slums, right? And there's a bridge here that is supposed to cross over to this sort of beautiful, houses in apartment blocks and the like. However, it is not very clear, right? It's blurry. So is there really those sort of benefits out there, right? Or is it just some kind of mask? So, it's kind of my attempt at saying it's really more of an ideology, and really, if you cross there, are you really going to get there, and are you going to find this, economic benefits and the like? So that, and then the large part of the sky is really that it's hard to reach.
Mm-hmm. Is that one of your photos?
Yes.
Okay.
Fantastic questions and reactions all around, and great to know the story of the cover, because now I'll be coming back to that myself. And I think it is very symbolic of where this book sort of goes in the conclusion, which is to really conceptualize this idea of the social production of homeownership tenure. And to delve into that. And so if you don't mind, I'm going to just read a really quick paragraph. This is on page 191 in the conclusion. Quote, an understanding of the social production of homeownership tenure, not only through neoliberal ideology and policies informed by neoclassical economics, but through intergenerational transfers of knowledge about homeownership, through the institution of the family, and through the state as an institution that produces and reproduces a preference for homeownership through policy support, is a shift that should recognize the role of neoliberal ideology, the family, and the state in social production processes, and should develop an appreciation of social reality through empirical evidence. So that's sort of I think a very important takeaway that Singumbe's book makes here is that evidence-based, data-driven decisions might mean that land tenure policies are culturally and contextually grounded. That what might work in Kibera might not work in Site C Kailicha, and what might work in Luanda or Zungo might not work in Lusaka. And I think that's there's something there around policy prescriptions that maybe originate, whether well-intended or not well-intended, in development institutions like the World Bank or in the global north, and then are applied somewhat monolithically across the African continent, and the potential pitfalls or dangers of that. There's also, I think, a really important lesson in this book that usufruct rights, right, which come from that case of Luanda, Angola, represent this rather comparatively unexplored alternative, right, that in certain institutional arrangements, in certain moments, may really hold promise as another alternative land tenure regime that could really lead to some good outcomes for people in different moments. So I'll also just mention a couple of interesting references. If folks have thoughts on backyarding and what the sort of economic exchange conditions are like with those, both Charlotte Lemansky and Sophie Oldfield have done empirical studies on that in the Western Cape. They're both cited in Dr. Muyeba's book, and they're really a lot of grounded work on some of those exchanges with the backyard shacks and other kinds of settlements. And then Achille Mbembe has this book chapter in the journal Public Culture called On the Figure of the Subject in Times of Crisis. This is about what ordinary people experienced when it comes to structural adjustment programs. Government, civil servants, or university professors all of a sudden moonlighting as taxi drivers because of the just rapid fire austerity and decimation of public sector bureaucracies. But this is potentially something that we might want to read in our own era of the Dogification of government. And there's something that we can learn perhaps from these experiences of structural adjustment in the United States today too. So thank you so much, Dr. Muyeba. This was just such a fantastic book. And it seems like you all enjoyed it as well. So get a copy. That's my plug for that.
I couldn't agree more with you, Stefan. Do get the book. One, you will find out who is the greatest fan and inspiration behind the book and supporter. And secondly, there's something for everyone. If you are into statistics, you love reading about statistics and interpreting statistics, the book is for you. If you love more thick descriptions, qualitative analysis, the book is for you. So really, I cannot thank Stefan enough for having taken the time to read the book, and Singumbe for coming to share his insight, and you all for coming here in week 9 in somewhat a beautiful day compared to previous days. Thank you so much. And I also want to thank Mandy for doing the logistics. So let's see what's his name, and Mandy.
Second.
Thank you so much, and I wish you a very lovely day.
Thanks.